Okay, well, it looks like we have a quorum. So first off, let me just thank you for joining us on this webinar on how to build world-class tech recruiting operations functions, and we can get into whether or not that should be the appropriate title. We were just talking about that later. We're so excited to see so many people interested in this topic. It's definitely one we were really thrilled to kind of host a session on, and very excited to chat about it today. I'm Jeffrey Spector. I'm the co-founder of Carrot, and I'm joined today by Brandon Johnson, recruiting operations team lead at Datadog, and Steph Liu, recruiting program manager at Pinterest. So thank you both for joining us today. Really appreciate you making the time. You may have noticed that I am not Shannon Hogue Brown, and I apologize for that. Shannon, unfortunately, couldn't make it today at the last minute, so I will do my best to live up to her high standards. So thank you for accommodating that, and she does send her regards. So for those of you who don't know Carrot, our mission is to make every interview predictive, fair, and enjoyable. We were really created to help alleviate some of the burdens and issues that we saw in interviewing. As you probably already know, it's hugely resource intensive. It's typically done in an ad hoc manner, and it's filled with biases and isn't data driven, which is part of the topic we're going to talk about today, and kind of doesn't improve necessarily at most companies. And our big aha was that we thought interviewing should be a job. So we created what we call interview engineering. And so just like there's front-end engineers and back-end engineers, we felt like there should be interview engineers, people whose job it was to focus on interviewing. And so there's really two parts to our model. The first part is that we actually interview on behalf of other companies like Pinterest. And that helps alleviate the burden that, the trade-off between building product and ramping up hiring. But the second part of our model is that we have deep partnerships with our clients where we look at all the data and the outcomes of all the interviews and try and help the hiring process get more efficient. And that is something that we've evolved over time. One thing that we noticed when we kind of started this work was that a lot of companies didn't understand the basic numbers and funnel metrics of what was going on. And we realized there was a huge difference between those companies that actually had people focused on this, the recruiting operations functions, and those that didn't. And their whole processes were way more effective and efficient. And so that is kind of was the genesis of this, of like, hey, how do we share the goodness that is recruiting operations with a broader set of people and take it from the experts and the people who are best at this. So with that, maybe we can kick off with some introductions here. And so maybe Steph, I'd love maybe if you could just start us off with an introduction and also how you got into recruiting operations.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Thank you for attending this Carrot seminar. My name is Stephanie, and I'm a program manager at Pinterest. I focus primarily on the strategy and planning side. So on our team, there's a strategy and planning, and then there's an ops side on the actual how and the tactical side of how to do things. So I focus more on the strategy and planning. And I've been a recruiter throughout my career at various companies. So I started at MongoDB, then I moved on to Yelp, and then Google and Box. And so I've seen companies at various stages of growth. And so I've done recruiting for so long that at that point, I was moving into a more strategic role, which did make sense, right? And so about 2 years ago when I was at Box, I actually switched into program management specifically for engineering, for the group that I ended up, that I was originally hiring for. And speaking to some of the things that Jeff mentioned around like, as you scale and grow, like you start to see issues with pass-through rates. And that's actually how I landed in engineering program management, is because that group specifically was having a really hard time scaling and calibrating against their interviews. And so I went in to help with that piece and then ended up supporting engineering operations. And it was only when I left recruiting that I was like, oh, I care a lot about it. I care a lot than I thought I would. Not that engineering is not amazing, but I realized that the most impact I can make is in recruiting. And so I decided to go back. And so that's why I'm at Pinterest doing recruiting program management. I love recruiting because I do firmly believe that your work should be purposeful and it's important to love what you do. And I feel like recruiting helps individuals get closer to what that means. And so it's not just about bringing people into the company, but bringing the right people in who will grow alongside the company. And how do you do it at scale and make sure that you're doing it efficiently? So yeah, that's a little bit about me.
That's great. It sounds like, that fit is so important, obviously, like making sure we talk a lot about how like just as much as we're interviewing people, they're interviewing us and they're interviewing the companies they're hiring for. And, that right fit is super important. So thanks for sharing. Brandon, maybe you can kick off with something similar.
Yeah, totally. So I'm Brandon Johnson. I lead recruiting ops here at Datadog. For those of you who don't know or haven't heard of Datadog, the TLDR version is our monitoring service for cloud scale applications. Outside of this, I also moonlight as a running coach after work when we're allowed to run in groups outside with New York Roadrunners. I've been in the recruiting industry for almost a decade. I think January will be a decade. So it feels like a long time. It makes me feel really old saying that. But like many people in this field, I fell into recruiting. I actually started my career as an engineer in the IT infrastructure world. I worked for an aerospace and defense contracting company called Butler, followed by a big data ETL company called SyncSort, which just got rebranded, I believe, as Precisely. Full-time while I was going to college, also full-time. At the end of school, I realized, I always loved figuring out like ways to optimize systems and processes. And, in fact, like as a kid, I was the type of person that would take everything apart to figure out how it worked, like VCRs, Nintendo, Sega, audio equipment, you name it. But as I was working in IT, I felt the problem was I didn't feel challenged enough. And I feel like I kind of got stunted and I stopped learning. So it was actually when I was working at SyncSort that a gentleman named Josh Rogers, who's now the VP of sales, or who was the VP of sales, I'm sorry, he's the CEO now. He inspired me to try to find a way to combine my technical knowledge with my people skills. He actually suggested that I consider moving into sales or recruiting. I think that was also because compared to most people on the team, I talked way too much. I decided to give agency recruiting a shot, and I felt that experience coming from IT would give me an advantage to quickly identify talent. So from IT, I pivoted into agency recruiting for 4 years. I did 3 years with a large outfit here in New York called Solomon Page, where I was actually promoted to a VP role my first year. I built out a book of business around open sourced web companies that were really early stage that no other recruiting agencies wanted to touch. And after seeing 2 of my babies, Etsy and Tumblr, go from really little startups to well-known successful businesses, I knew that I eventually wanted to help build one of these companies of my own. So I moved into my first internal role at a New York-based startup called Makespace. I was one of the first 20 hires there. In the course of 3 years, I helped scale the team or the company to over 300 across 5 geos. And that was an amazing experience because that was the first time I got to step outside of just technical recruiting and also get into ops recruiting, which we tended to run more like a marketing team, sort of like Uber did like the driver acquisition model. I was a team of 1 until we were 150. So we were really scrappy. I had basically no budget. But thankfully, back in, I think, 2014 or 15, one of the co-founders, my boss, Rahul, was introduced to Carrot, who he met through, I believe it was a VC connection. Carrot at that time was just getting started. We desperately needed a way to figure out how to better align our process and scale our engineering team without sucking away too many engineering hours. And it was a wonderful partnership for us. We were able to quantify the value of outsourcing versus doing it ourselves, and the results really paid off for us. So after 3 years there, I went to Codecademy, which I think most people have heard of. It's an ed tech company. I spent a year and a half there helping unify their processes, transition to an ATS, a new ATS, implement structured hiring, built out a team that helped the company more than 2x. And similarly to Makespace, we got to this growing pain where, we had management changes. We had trouble, arriving to hiring consensus around especially senior engineering talent. So once again, I saw Carrot as a lifeline to help us scale quickly. And I believe they are still working with Carrot at this time. So that experience really sparked my fascination with data. So I started dropping into data science office team office hours. I collaborated with them to build out talent insights using Looker to gain better understanding of our hiring processes, where was the leaks in the funnel. And while that data set was really small, really set the light bulb off that my ideal role would be owning analytics and operations and strategy for a company that was fast growing. And they needed somebody to just do this. So 2 years ago, almost to the day, I found my role at Datadog. I've been here for 2 years, and in that time, we've grown from 800 to over 2,000 that was a really fast growth. We IPO'd last year. We're continuing to grow a lot. I currently oversee a team of 3 supporting a 70-person global talent organization, and I actually report to a VP of engineering, which I'll get into a little bit later. But my team is primarily focused on unifying processes, optimizing inefficiencies, data integrity, analytics, and a ton of special projects and initiatives.
Awesome. Wow, that was first of all, your desire to talk a lot is going to come in handy today. So appreciate you sharing with that. But it sounds like the decomposition of things that you were talking about, kind of breaking down how to build things up from scratch, sounds like a perfect background for recruiting ops and like making sure that everything is working as efficiently and as possible. So thank you for sharing. Before we kind of get into a couple questions we have, just note for any person attending that we'll have a Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions at all, please put your questions in the chat and we'll try to get to as many of those as possible. So I really want to understand now, I guess, how did you guys know when your company or your team needed recruiting operations? Like what happened to actually, I don't know if it had been there from the start or was there a realization? It sounded like Steph, maybe that at least at Box, it was kind of, wow, we ran into a problem and then it was, maybe after we already noticed the problem was there that we kind of tried to make up for the lost time. But I'd love to hear, especially at your current companies, like how did you guys create this group and how did it come about? So maybe Steph, can you start us off?
Absolutely. Yeah, so I think recruiting ops and recruiting programs is something that is so undervalued. You don't see it at a lot of companies. And that's what happened at Box, right? Like when I was a recruiter, I was also owning the program management piece and it became so big and so large that you realize like I can't possibly focus on closing and also scaling the recruiting team at the same time. And that's one thing that I think Pinterest did really well is that they acknowledged that this was a problem to begin with and something that we needed to have. And so our team has grown a lot and also changed a lot because like when you look at recruiting programs and it's kind of like how Brandon described, it can be very nebulous, right? Like you can own tools, you can own talent brand, you can own internal mobility, employee referral program. Essentially, we become the catch-all for any program or project that recruiting doesn't want to do. And they're just like, yeah, this is yours now. We're going to focus on closing, which makes sense. Like they should focus entirely on closing and we should build the system to support how they can best do that. And so anytime like I've seen the team grow and it's grown a lot since I've been here is when you see them typically scale from small to medium or medium to large size, right? Like that's when you tend to see like hyper growth, hiring becomes a lot more complex. It starts to focus a lot on senior level roles and it starts to focus on really large volumes. So as a company begins to grow, I think it's really easy for orgs and teams to start to run off and do their own things, right? They're like, I have my own org specific thing, my own team specific thing. And the issue with that is that you become so siloed into your own process. And this can be messy. It's messy for the systems that support it, like your ATS systems, all of your recruiting tools and what that workflow looks like. From a compliance standpoint, that causes a lot of issues if people are using things differently. You start to see candidate experience start to falter, right? Because candidate experience in one place looks a little bit different than another role. And then how you interview and how you level individuals are a little bit different between the orgs. And so you start to see like maybe biz and non-tech recruiting start to like grow separately. And so that's when you start to have to like bring it a little bit back in to make sure that you are communicating a clear candidate experience and culture and brand to your candidates, and that you are other things that like you may see is like pass-through rates, like things start to look a little bit weird when you're looking at the calibration, right, as you're scaling, and hiring teams may not be equipped with the information they need to appropriately interview and identify the right talent. So you start to see pass-through rates vary between like different groups. And so that's typically when you see ops start to come in, right? Because you start to need a more standardized process for all of these reasons, because you need to increase efficiency, you need to do it quickly, but you need to do it in a compliant way while preserving candidate experience and ensuring that there's the right guardrails in place. So that's typically when I see that come in play.
Yeah, we see a lot of that with some of our clients where they have like maybe different offices, and you'll see for any given level of like performance on a candidate interview, you have wildly different outcomes when they go on site. And so you know that you come hiring for different reasons, and they've got to kind of centralize and make it consistent, especially when internal mobility is increasing as an important, one team needs to trust the hires from another team. Just real quick, one follow up.
Right.
Where do you draw the line when it sounds like a lot of projects get thrown at you? Like, do you say no ever, or where do you draw the line on stuff that falls outside and inside your purview?
Our team does not say no. Yeah, we have a line. It's not strictly enforced. It's a blurry line. So we try to draw the line between any project or program that impacts both biz and tech recruiting is when recruiting programs will come in. That's not to say that we definitely don't take like org or like team specific programs, but I think we try to focus on the large scale things that will be more company wide focused. So that's where we try to draw the line. Try is a very like key word here.
Yeah. If you're strategic and operational, like you're going to get a lot of projects. So, and Brandon, how did
Yes.
recruiting ops come to Datadog? And it sounds like maybe they already had the idea when they hired you. I don't know if there was a team that existed there. I would love to hear about the evolution at Datadog.
Yeah, totally. So prior to me joining, I actually joined with somebody else. So one of my direct reports, oh, she wasn't my direct report when I started, but now she's one of my direct reports. Her and I started at the same time. And what ended up happening was the leader of our business recruiting org and the leader of our tech recruiting org kind of just got to the point where they realized they were spending way too much time on ops and administrative work, particularly in our applicant tracking system, and trying to like glue all these things together. And when they started venting and talking about it, they realized like, hey, this is like at least one full-time person's job, like maybe two. And thus we ended up hiring two people to start. But I think like for us, the straw that really broke the camel's back was we got to the point where, you know, similar to what Steph had just mentioned, you know, like at Pinterest and our other companies, tech and business sort of eventually start to split, and there's like a rift, and there's different processes and different systems. For us, when I joined, there were 182 different stage names being used across both teams. So we couldn't run really any useful reports right out of our applicant tracking system to see how we were doing and how we can use those insights to forecast against that for the future. Additionally, processes, you know, continued to get fragmented. We had so many different ways of doing things, not just between the tech recruiting team and the business recruiting team, but even the recruiting pods on those specific teams. So, you know, they basically said, we need to figure out a way to understand our data. We need to bring people in to sort of align what our processes are, take stock of the tools that we're using, understand the various workflows, and sort of identify how do we create like a more unified recruiter, I guess, like experience or recruiter workflow. That's really like how it started here. And, you know, fortunately, as I mentioned earlier, I report into, so tech recruiting at Datadog actually reports into engineering, whereas business recruiting reports into the G&A and HR, our CHRO. So because we have engineering resources, we were able to start to build out you know, myself and my counterpart, Susanna, joining, we were able to build out, you know, like some interesting like data pipelines and workflows by leveraging some of the engineering resources that we had at our disposal. But it was, you know, it wasn't 100% of time wasn't being spent on how do we make this like really good, right? It was sort of like, let's throw an MVP together, you know, and let's try to like iterate it over time. So it wasn't really until like we had the ability to bring other people in to really take ownership of these things from like a product sort of perspective that we were able to, you know, like push the envelope and then unify what we were doing on the end side for the business side as well.
Yeah, so it sounds like not only were you running recruiting operations, but also you were a PM on your own products that you needed.
Yes.
So, I mean, we run into this issue a lot too, where there's kind of like in the ATS, there's garbage in, garbage out. Like it's hard if the data is not there and it's not, you know, there's no fidelity there. It makes it really hard to even say anything about your funnels or anything else that you'd want to learn from it. A lot of that also though is humans like inputting data in there. I mean, how did you overcome that? Like, how do you make sure you're getting the appropriate data in so that you can make sense of it all?
So that's a good question. So so our ATS is Greenhouse, and Greenhouse has an open API. And if you're an enterprise customer, you do get access to all of your production data daily, whether you decide to put it in like Redshift or S3. So we actually use two tools. We use Looker as our BI tool, and then we also use Airtable. And what we use Airtable for is more like a view and presentation layer. So when the recruiters come in every day, like we show them like their entire candidate pipeline, like in one single pane of glass, in a way that no ATS I've ever used can do, where a recruiter can go in and let's say I'm working on these 15 roles or 10 recs. I can see a list of all of my candidates and I can group them by like the stages that they're in, specific hiring managers and what have you. And what we did is we used those two tools to surface the pieces of metadata that we were having issues getting. So we have to have a report called Missing Details, and every day all of our recruiting teams like have like quick 15-minute stand-ups, and one of the first things that they do is they inspect all the data and hold each other accountable to make sure sure that they are getting all those missing details in. So that's like just like getting like the data in. The second part of that question though is thinking about the data integrity. So that was a lot of work on the ops team. So what we did, some of the first big undertakings that we did were to standardize all the stages, stage names, and throughout the whole interview process, so we can run like meaningful reports. But additionally, we started cleaning up other pieces of applicant tracking system built-in metadata. And I'm talking about things like sources and realigning, like, okay, like how do we actually bucket like all of these sources? Like, is this really a prospecting source? Is this really a third-party board source? Is this really like a whatever source? So we actually overhauled that entire thing, which included also going back and auditing like previous candidates and a lot of manual entry and cleanup. We did the same thing with the rejection reasons, rejection strategies. We cleaned up the tags that were being used by the recruiters, as well as any candidate and job custom fields. So I give not just my team on the recruiting ops side, but our entire recruiting coordination team a ton of credit, because, you know, it really took a village to get all that stuff done and cleared up. But once you have all that data clean and the recruiters know like what the process is and when to use like each field, it does make it a lot easier, but it is a big manual lift. And you need buy-in, but the results are worth it.
Yeah, wow, that's probably some of the most extreme efforts I've ever heard of, like getting to ATS, you know, clean up the ATS. And I love the strategy of exposing the data to the recruiters and things, and so that they're kind of like, wait, this isn't right. It's like as it gets more and more accurate and it's only the last 10%, then people are much more willing to fix and correct and add it in. But if it's everything's off, then maybe there's less incentive to do that. Mm-hmm. Steph, I'm curious, how do you think about like metrics? Like, what are your top metrics that you monitor? You know, what are you looking at on a day-to-day or week-to-week basis to make sure that the programs you're running are effective?
Yeah, so it really depends on what you're looking at, right? Like if you're talking about tools, I think before I came into Pinterest, like there actually wasn't a clear philosophy on what we wanted for our tools, right? And so with that coming in, we decided to actually implement a couple of success metrics that we apply evenly to any tool that we assess, as well as to the tools that we have on board. And it can be both qualitative and quantitative, right? And the ultimate goal of our recruiting tools is to increase our reach and efficiency and promote our brand, to improve candidate experience, and make sure that we get the highest ROI while also impacting data integrity. So that's one piece that we really think about. And so when we look at success metrics, it really is tailored a little bit to the tool. We have like a toolbox of like things we want to measure, but I think it would be odd to like say that every tool needs to meet a specific requirement. But for us, like I think one of the key things that kind of layer on is like, what is the existing workflow for this tool and how does it complement our existing workflows in-house? Because I think what Brandon says, like, it's a really good point, right? Like you get to a point where data integrity is a problem. And a lot of this is because systems don't actually talk well with each other, right? Like we have Gem, we have Carrot, we have Greenhouse, we have LinkedIn, and all of these individual products in some way also compete with each other. So there's less of incentive for them to partner and integrate fully and do it in a way that makes sense. And so the biggest thing that we really look at is when we assess is like, does this integrate with our existing ATS? And how does it complement all the other workflows, right? And will this create confusion with where the source is attributed to? How does this impact like actually moving profiles into the ATS? How does this show up in our ATS? So that's something that we really keep a keen eye on. Other metrics that are obviously important is pass-through rates, right? Like ultimately we want to know if a tool is helping us to find talent and bring them in the house. And that will depend on the tool. There's some tools that work at the top of the funnel and help you find candidates. And there's some that work a little bit more in the middle, which is where like Carrot falls. And so pass-through rates is something that we do definitely pay attention to. And then obviously something that is really big for us this year is inclusion and diversity, right? We ultimately want to bring a tool that helps us to better understand the talent market, both overall, but also understand the talent market for URM and URG individuals. And then in addition to that, like how does this tool potentially impact or prevent bias within in what we're doing? So that is another metric that is really important to us. So that's tools. I can go on forever about it, but there's also other things that we are in charge of, like the employee referral program, right? And that's another set of metrics. And ultimately, the employee referral program is another way in which you bring in talent. And based on industry standards, we have a certain percentage that we try to get to so that you have the right source and you're considering all the right talent pools. And then the common thing I think with employee referral programs that is coming up a lot is it adversely affecting inclusion and diversity? Because if you are similar, you know similar people and you're bringing in similar people, and so that just attributes to the problem. So something that we pay special mind to is, one, how are offer accepts coming through referrals? What does that breakdown look like for IND? Does it adversely affect it? What are our most key business needs and critical hiring areas, and how can we tailor the program to make sure we increase referrals in those areas? So it really depends on what kind of thing that you're working on. And for Pinterest, because we both deal with tools, we deal with employee referral program, we deal with internal mobility, as well as embedded competencies. Like, it can really depend on the person who's leading that program or project to set those success metrics.
Yeah, it's there's probably some common themes here of like, and we'll touch on DEI more in a second, but it's like the earlier you started, the easier it is to be successful. Same with if you're having to go back and clean up thousands of candidate records is a lot harder than if you do it right off the bat. And I think the same thing is, referral programs get a lot easier if you have a diverse workforce right from the start. Then maybe it combats some of that inclusion challenges from the referral program.
Yeah. Absolutely. Like, I think it depends on what you're working on, but I will say our team, before we even start a program or a project or even think about revamping what something looks like, we first have to take a step back and understand the current state and do a little bit of market research to understand what other companies are doing and the existing gaps that we have before we come out with like, okay, so what are the success metrics that we want to set? And it's so dependent on what you're trying to achieve. So I will say that there is a little bit, it would be difficult to put it under like, all things go under this set of success metrics. It really kind of depends on what project you're trying to tackle.
Got it. And is that consistent for you, Brandon? And do you have a favorite metric at all, or any metrics that have surprised you?
Oh man, I have so many favorite metrics. I'd echo everything that Stefko said. We totally, I think we struggle with a lot of those same challenges, particularly around like referrals, particularly if you are, like most tech companies that have a huge engineering team and a huge sales team, which like by and large tend to be not very diverse talent pools. And if you rely solely on referrals, that does tend to lead to building and expanding a more homogeneous team. So, being really, intentional, I think is important. I think for me though, from a stats perspective, some of the things that I honestly, favorite metric, that's gonna be hard. Well, we have a couple of custom metrics that we track. I think from a diversity perspective, the EEO status, the EEO survey, for example, like EEO reporting is one of my favorite things to dig into. And the reason being is I'm sure like most of the people that are on this call, you work for a company where not everybody is applying directly, right? So if they're not applying directly, your candidates are probably not filling out the EEOC survey, unless your recruiters are intentionally sending them the EEOC survey if they're here in the US, right? Or if you're forcing every person that you prospect or who's referred to also fill out an application. So I'd say that's my favorite thing to dive into, because at no company I've worked at before did we really have enough volume to see like what the pipeline actually looked like from like a statistics perspective. I came to Datadog and I noticed on both business and on engineering recruiting, we did rely super heavily, obviously, on prospecting and referrals for closing talent. I believe like at this time, maybe like 2 years ago, maybe 40% of all applicants were even, getting the opportunity to see the EEOC status. So going back to data integrity, one of the things that I put front and center of all the US recruiters is EEOC status. They can't see the answers to the questions, but one of the things that we do pull in our data pipeline is, was this candidate even sent this? So like if they're a prospective candidate or if they're a referral, where they sent this. And just like seeing now that we've become so diligent about making sure that every person that we are interacting with is actually filling this out, and seeing how like we're actually able to see like what the pipeline looks like in various departments like over time. That's something that I'm really passionate about. Like as a person of color, this is something that means a lot to me. And seeing the organization change and seeing the industry change, as a whole, there's obviously so much work to be done like in this space, and there's so much, more work to be done in not just creating more diverse teams and more equitable places of work, but I'd say like that's probably my favorite from like a built into your ATS perspective. Another thing that we do track that I really love is we created a custom metric which we call a chance of offer, where after the initial recruiter screen, we ask the recruiters like on like a scale of like, you know, like 10% to 90%, like what's your gut feeling that this person that you just spoke to, you know, is going to make it through our process. And this is a private field, the hiring managers can't see this, but the reason that we started tracking this is we wanted to see how well were our recruiters aligned, not just like with like the bar that we were looking for from like a technical perspective, but, you know, does this person have like interesting experiences that are going to either bring like a diverse type of experience or, you know, some type of experience that would be really interesting for us, like here at Datadog. And what we found was our recruiters are doing an amazing job with like candidates that are, you know, they're pretty confident are going to make it through the process. Those people are also the hardest to close. And usually when they get to offer, have like 4 or 5 other offers from other companies. We did understand that by measuring this, our recruiters were spending a lot of time, you know, like pushing through candidates that they were like, yeah, this person might have a chance. You know, and we basically use that as a way to retrain our recruiters on, you know, like what we look for, what like our technical bar is, like how to look for these identifiers like in your initial screens or as you're sourcing or reviewing referrals. And that's actually helped us tremendously, you know, become more efficient over time.
Yeah, I love those. We've kind of talked about where we would have like, what is the odds of a hire to factor in the close rates too, because, you know, then you kind of have that balance between the percentage likelihood an offer, but and also to close them. The DEI data where you're, I mean, are your recruiters actually like, kind of, is it part of their performance reviews as to like what percentage gets sent this survey, and are they held accountable to those metrics? And just curious, like, where are you guys in terms of collecting that? Like, if you're willing to share, like, has that grown in terms of the percentage of candidates that are filling out that data? Like, where are you, just so we can understand the kind of standard?
Yeah, totally. So for most teams, we've seen massive double-digit increases in completion rates. That is something that my team is working hand in hand with our internal analytics team right now, as we're building more robust dashboards to hold the teams accountable. One of the things that we do have SLAs that we hold the recruiters to. One of those is making sure that all US candidates are being sent the EOC survey. We have SLAs around the time that we're getting in touch with referrals that are submitted, how fast offers are getting approved, offer decisions are being made, and things like this. So we're actually in the process of building dashboards that we will be able to measure their adherence to these SLAs over a period of time, which we hope will be done by the end of this quarter.
Got it. That's great. And I know we're going to open up soon to Q&A. If anybody has any questions, please throw them in the chat here. Steph, I know you're also very passionate about DEI, as you kind of were talking about. And also, I'd love to hear kind of what impact you think your team or the recruiting ops has had on DEI at Pinterest, but also, you know, university recruiting is obviously one strategy to go after a more diverse workforce. And so I'm just, maybe you could talk a little bit about your work on the university side and how you've streamlined that, and kind of how that relates to your DEI strategy as well.
Yeah, so university, you know, as I mentioned before, as we scale teams, we really try to draw a little bit of parity between all of them. So every time we think about tech and non-tech, we're also thinking about exec as well as UR. So like essentially when we roll out a program that supports inclusion, diversity, we're looking at it through all different pods. And so for us this year, that meant implementing DSAs across all of our roles, which is really hard to do because you can anticipate that it does. Like hiring quickly can come at odds with implementing DSAs. And so that's something that we had to go through this year to make sure that we made a commitment to to our inclusion and diversity goals. So this is applied across all of our roles right now, with the understanding that like we obviously have to slow down hiring a little bit to make sure that we are considering all talent pools equally. And then I think what layers on top of that is actually level transparency that ties to compensation, as well as our MRED competency. So something that we had to get very clear on this year is moving away from years of experience and truly how are you interviewing, and based on your qualifications and how you interview informs what your level and your compensation looks like. So that's actually the big beast that we're tackling this year, is we have a standardized competency that we measure across Pinterest, but then how do you take that that, tailor it down to individual orgs and departments, and then also like assess like both the core skills, which is like ties to your culture values, but then also the functional skills. And so we are actually testing that with sales and recruiting now, where we are breaking down the rubrics, the competencies into rubrics, and redoing all of our interviewing to ensure that when we're interviewing, we are mitigating bias, that we are not relying on previous number of years of experience, but truly what you're qualified as well as your ability to perform against the role based on core competencies and functional skills outlined within our rubrics. So those are two, I would say, really meaty pieces of things that we are trying to do. And then looking obviously to ERP, that's something that our team actually handles. And so there is also a question of like, we should be paying out more for URM and URG referral bonuses, which sounds like a really wild idea. And it's not something that we are 100% committed to, but we're 100% committed to exploring what that would look like and whether or not that makes sense for our team. And knowing that like referral bonuses isn't the only way in which you can strategically impact hiring. You can partner with your ERG community leads. You can develop strategies to educate them more on what employee referral program means to them, but also educate the recruiting team on how do you, like, what are some use cases where you see individuals that may not fit the blanket resume that you're looking at, but can still be successful at a tech company? And then in addition to that is also looking like, this is what all of the work overlaps, right? Because a lot of what employee referral program does, or like people's negative impact around employee referral program, is I didn't have a good experience. People don't get back to me in time. I don't know why I got rejected. And this isn't just an employee referral program problem. This is a company candidate experience problem, right? So then we're also looking at how can we best prepare individuals to interview, but depending on what niche groups they follow, what feedback is appropriate. Like I think previously a lot of teams and companies may have been a little bit more conservative around like, we don't move forward, and we don't move forward because you just can't fit into this role, right? And you don't want to open a Pandora's box around like what that could be. And so we are trying to get a little bit more clear on giving feedback in a way that is caring, in a way that, you know, takes into the fact that like candidates are humans, and like we want to give unbiased feedback, but also make sure that we're doing it in a way that is legal. And then also with SLAs, similar to what Brandon said, enforcing SLAs actually for candidates and referrals. So I don't know about you, Brandon. Our team actually, like, it's not an issue of like, actually it is an issue of this data integrity standpoint, but it's also the separate issue for us of like, I give you the data and what does that mean for you? Does it matter? And it oftentimes, like, I think the issue we're dealing with is that it doesn't matter. Like, we can surface it all you want, and we can clean it all you want, and we can share it with managers and recruiters, but somehow it's not hitting close to home. So now we are at this point of like, how can we tie this into performance metrics, right? Like, because data integrity is absolutely your job, and it helps to inform our recruitment strategies, and it also helps to inform how we're performing against these other ad hoc projects. And so now we're in the place of building it into performance metrics to help understand and inform like how a recruiter is performing, but also our overall recruitment strategy. Does that make sense? Like, it's so like everything just like layers on top of each other.
Totally. And when you say performance metrics, you're talking about the recruiter performance or the actual like candidate performance when they get hired?
Yes. Yeah. So obviously what ties into recruiter performance metrics is obviously the candidate survey, and then also how they perform once they actually join the team.
Got it. Yeah. I think it's your talk about the candidates obviously being human. We think there's a huge opportunity in like providing better feedback in real time. And honestly, I think candidates don't mind like not getting a job sometimes, as long as they're transparently, quickly communicated with, as long as it's fair and they understand where they are. And that's so important that you're setting SLAs. There's a question related to kind of some of what you were talking about that came through. That is, it sounds like you guys do enablement in addition to your program. Like, you know, you're enabling and training like recruiters and engineers. What does that look like, and how much of your job is focused on that?
Yeah, good question. So when COVID hit, before we were recruiting programs, it was 3 people holding down the house, and we were doing tools, employee referral program, ad hoc projects, and then COVID hit. And I'm not sure about the rest of everyone on the call, but like for us, we actually had to take a step back to reprioritize where we were hiring because of COVID, and it impacted our business. And so we actually in that time were like, let's spin up 36 recruiting projects dealing with MRED competencies, revamping all of our systems, internal mobility, optimizing our career site, GDPRs. These are all really high priority things, but also incredibly complex things that you are asking recruiters to lead, which if you don't come from a program management background, it is a challenge. Even when you come from a program management background, you're like, how do I do this? And so at that point in time, we realized like our team, and I don't know if everybody else felt this on the call, there was never a slowdown for ops. As soon as COVID hit, it was how can we now think about the future of remote work? How do we tailor a recruitment strategy to fit that? How does this look like in our system when we have multi-location recs? And then also, how do you deal with the now? Like candidates are switching to virtual. So what is our virtual talent brand? What is our virtual recruitment experience look like? So we never got a break. And in fact, work just layered on top of it. And so that's when, like, again, thinking about scaling the team, when we realized like 3 people can't both deal with the strategy piece and then also the implementation, which is driving adoption, getting people to understand how to do it. And so we do work very closely together. We're hand in hand in, but what me and my manager in charge of is primarily thinking about like when a project or program comes into play, how do we strategically tailor this and how do we set up the success metrics and what does phasing look like and what do the different versions look like in partnership and consultation from enablement, which deals with the on the ground, how are people absorbing this information and how does it work for them. And so you can really think of it as like we kind of incubate, think about the strategy and program, create a proposal and a structure, and then we move forward and we pass it to enablement. And enablement focuses on like, how do we actually get people to adopt what this looks like?
Got it. So you kind of have divide and conquer there. And Brandon, is
Correct.
that similar? Well, one, did you see a similar kind of increase in work or non-decrease in work coming from COVID? And 2, like, is that kind of how you guys work in terms of enablement as well, or is it also housed in your org?
Totally. So definitely saw a massive spike once COVID started. We actually used Jira to track all the work that people ask of recruiting ops. So we sort of set it up dually as a ticketing system for requests to come in from anybody in the recruiting org, for asks from my team, as well as for us to track our OKRs. And as we started looking at the reports, we're like, wow, the volume is going up, 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 up. So we actually got additional headcount. We just added another person onto the recruiting ops team 2 weeks ago. So super excited about that. But yeah, I feel like we're sort of shifting more from just overseeing like ops and analytics into moving more towards enablement. And one such example that I could give is, for us, interviewer training is something that we take very seriously, and making sure that we're providing like a very consistent interview process to all candidates. And engineering interviews in particular are so much more complex than non-technical interviews, in the fact that we have some interviews that are doing, the technical video interview. We have some that are grading take-home assignments. We have some that are doing coding and design interviews like on-site, right? So that takes a lot of one-on-one, that takes a lot of shadowing, it takes a lot of practice. And typically, pre-COVID, we were doing this like all as a in-person training, where people can obviously join like via Zoom, but it was very much done like in person in each office. As we shifted to being like fully remote, like that's something that we struggled with, because as the company started growing and growing and growing, and as we had all these headcount requests to continue to fill, we started reaching capacity constraints. So we actually made the conscious decision about 2 months ago to start shifting interviewer training to be self-service. So one of the projects that my team has been spearheading in conjunction with our recruiting coordination team is developing self-service courses and modules, learning modules in Udemy, which is another e-learning platform that we use pretty heavily. We do have the support of a formal L&D team that sort of like laid the foundation of how do you create like a good course, good pedagogy, like learning outcomes and things like that. But that developing the content, recording the videos, doing the training modules is all being driven by both the recruiting ops and the recruiting coordination team. And we expect that to be like fully launched and ready to go like really soon. So I'm really excited about that. And I think that's one example of moving from just like purely like operations to enabling the team. And there's a lot of other interesting work in regards to interviewer training that is being done, here at Datadog in Udemy as well. We've got tons of different courses that we use across all different areas of the business. Our technical solutions team has like, I think dozens or maybe hundreds of courses that they've created for onboarding new employees, because it's going to be a while till we're all back in the office together. So we need to figure out how to make this whole remote thing work. And I think this is a really useful way for you to take a step back, develop the content, make it usable, and then use that to scale your team or your function.
Yeah, it's basically what are the opportunities that this opens up that people, you can leverage software a lot more and potentially focus on the scalability of these programs in a different way than you had done it when you had to focus on in person. And I know we're running on time here. I do have one last question for you both. And again, really appreciate you taking the time to share your expertise and wisdom with us. But, we're talking here about building world-class recruiting operations functions. If you guys had one piece of advice for somebody who's really looking to build that function and or scale it, what would it be? And I didn't, this is not previewed, so putting you on the spot here.
So I think my initial thought, and I'm very much so an introverted thinker, so excuse me, I take time to marinate and digest on things, which is why I spent 50% of my time researching things before I commit to anything. But I think as you're thinking about this function and speaking about, Jeff, I just mentioned, like, we have a hard time really drawing the line between what we own and what we can own. And I think what has tremendously been helpful or is helpful for teams like this is that programs can easily become a very nebulous thing. You can easily just unload everything under the sun, right, into this team. And I think that as you're thinking about building this team, it's important to be deliberate and intentional about what they should own and what they shouldn't own. But then not only within that, but I think when you're thinking about scaling any company and like any team, really, it will be difficult for them to deliver things with high quality and efficiency if we don't understand how to ruthlessly prioritize what we are focusing on, right? And so when you're looking at what you want to tackle and some of the biggest key things with your team and what you want to do with it, like there's going to be a combination of things that are easy to accomplish, low hanging fruit, and there's going to be things that are highly complex but high priority. And so what has really helped us is when we look at the projects that we take on is creating a criteria actually around like, how do we actually prioritize this? What is the impact that it has on cross-functional teams? How many bodies does it take to make this work? Is this tied to an OKR? Is it tied to bigger themes that you're seeing with your team as far as like culture issues? We did a SWOT analysis to really understand what are the biggest issues with our team. How does it go and support that? And we use all of these things to create a criteria for like how we prioritize work. And I think that was something that was tremendously important and necessary to set us up for success and continue to deliver high quality work.
Yeah, focus and prioritizations is coming through loud and clear. I think any really great growing company probably has way too many opportunities at hand in front of them that they could tackle, and the best ones figure out which ones to focus on most. So that totally resonates. And Brandon, how about you?
I'd say I'd echo what Steph said, but what the piece of advice that I got when I joined was to think like a rock climber and try to go for the things that are within reach. Don't try to like do like a Superman jump and like get to the top of the mountain, because you're probably going to fall and it's going to be really painful on the way down. But when you start small, like you tend not to overpromise and then underdeliver. I think what's really important is like having some way, whether it's via a Google Doc or Google Sheet, or using something like Trello, which we used to use, or Jira, or any type of system for you to really like start to like track the work that's being done, so you can take stake of like how much is being asked. I think that's really important. Starting small and really focus on things that are actually going to push the business forward. There's so many requests, like in our Jira board, we've got like an icebox category of just like amazing ideas and requests and stuff. And it's like, sure, if we had a 10-person company, we'd be able to get all of these done like every like 2-week sprint. But we don't right now. So what we try to do is take a step back and we talk about it collectively as a team on the ops team, including like our global head of tech recruiting and business recruiting. But if you don't have that team, talk about it with your stakeholders, talk about it with the rest of your recruiting team. Which of these initiatives are actually going to push the business forward, and start there. Like there's so many, especially when you're talking about data, there's so many different like metrics and like KPIs and things that you can track, but really focus on the things that are actually going to help you achieve your goals. Like if you're a company that, is really trying to make, an impact, with diversifying your workforce, getting that EEOC data is probably the most important thing that you can do, right? Like if you're really struggling to get people to convert when you bring so many candidates for face-to-face interviews to offers, I think it's really important to take a step back and really, dive into the data, with like your pass-through rates or like how candidates are performing in specific interviews. So I'd say like really like always take stake and think about what's actually going to push the business forward. And it's kind of like the need versus want, kind of a dilemma that I think we have in our personal lives.
No, I love that. And so if I'm translating, it's don't be Alex Honnold and try and free solo El Cap, but make sure you have some ropes and make sure you got a strong hold in what you're going to do and still make it to the top, but just do it in a really thoughtful, impactful way.
Totally.
So, all right. Well, thank you. I know we're running out of time. I'm sure there's a lot more questions here that we could get to. So I really appreciate you both taking the time this morning, and thank you everyone for attending today. We will, I believe, have a recording of this that we can make at least certain bits of public if you guys want to watch this afterwards. So thank you again both for your time, and really appreciate your wisdom.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for having us.